Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Since we have actually audience online, I should start right away. So it is great to be back again here in Warsaw at the 9th Global Forum on Nicotine. My name is Grzegorz Król, and I would like to welcome you all. Welcome to those with us here in Warsaw. Welcome back to those who were with us in the previous years. And finally, welcome to the international audience online. The theme for this year is tobacco harm reduction, here for good. Harm reduction through safer nicotine products can hasten the end of smoking and other risky tobacco use. GFN 22 will explore the science behind the approach, the policy and regulatory changes needed to maximize its potential, as well as the barriers to its implementation around the world. The event is taking place here in Warsaw, but being also watched globally. Selected sessions, including this one, are being streamed live with simultaneous translation into Spanish. People smoke for the nicotine, but they die from the tar. You will hear that phrase again today, and certainly over the next 2 days. It is as true today as it was half a century ago when Michael Russell used it for the first time in a BMJ article. This event, the Michael Russell Oration, is in memory of Michael Russell. You will hear more about him from Professor Jerry Stimson later today, while I would now like to say a few words about the person who will deliver this year's oration, Konstantinos Farsalinos. A physician and a highly cited research associate at the University of Patras and the University of West Attica in Greece. His field of expertise is public health. He is in the top 0.1% of scientists with the highest global research impact in the past decade, according to the Web of Science. Konstantinos authored the first systematic review on e-cigarette safety in 2014. He has published so far approximately 100 studies and articles in international peer-reviewed scientific journals, mostly about smoking, tobacco harm reduction, and alternative to smoking nicotine products. In recent time, he responded promptly to the need of the times, extending his focus to the relationship between smoking, nicotine, and COVID-19. With 10 peer-reviewed articles on the topic published so far. Listing just the major bullet points from his professional bio would take more time than we have for the whole oration, so let me finish my introduction by welcoming Konstantinos Farsalinos to give the 9th Michael Russell Oration. Welcome.
It's an amazing honor. Thank you very much, Jerry, and everyone for this invitation. I know, Jerry, that I promised that I will keep the 29.5-minute limit. Unfortunately, I won't be able to adhere to this promise. That was a promise given before I completed my presentation. So I always have this issue. So can someone upload my presentation here at least? Okay. That's the title of my presentation. It's not going to be about data like you're used to from me. It's about tobacco control and the conduct of tobacco control. Science, scientism, prejudice, and ethics in tobacco control. As the famous sociologist Ulrich Beck said back in 1986 in his German first edition book, we are living in the age of the risk society. And by risk society, he means that modern society has become a risk society, in the sense that it is increasingly occupied with debating, preventing, and managing risk that it itself has produced, unlike previous centuries when the risk was usually naturally derived from nature. And one of the unfortunate developments of modern age was the development of the automatic rolling cigarette machine, the so-called Bonsack machine in 1883, which resulted in the propagation of the smoking habit throughout the world. How do we manage and address risk in modern societies? Well, in science we trust. Or should we? We need to differentiate trust from faith. Faith is blindly believing without any supportive evidence, or even contrary to available evidence, based on emotion and by submitting intellect, by being intellectually by showing intellectual humility. It's a typical case of religion. We have faith in religion. But the difference with trust is that trust is observational based and conditional upon the character, the actions, the honesty, and several other factors of an organization or a person, depending on whether you trust a person or an organization. Trust can be earned or lost. It shouldn't be taken for granted. It's irrational and self-destructive to trust without scrutiny. It's very limiting and would stifle one's intellectual development if you immediately dismiss everything that someone says as irrelevant or contrary to reality. And let's not forget the motto of the Royal Society, which is nullius in verba. Take nobody's word for it. Look for the evidence yourself. Don't take anything for granted because you trust someone who says that. With tobacco control, it basically acts in this modern risk society as a risk management and risk regulation instrument or industry, if you prefer, addressing smoking. But is it smoking or tobacco use in general or nicotine use? Is it about the health effects of tobacco use and smoking or about morality and behavior of use? These are questions that we are going to address later in the presentation. There are various organizations and, of course, individual scientists that participate in this instrument or industry. Example of organizations are the WHO, the CDC, the FDA, the local public health authorities in every country. Tobacco control uses science, or that's what they say, to identify, examine, analyze, quantify, and resolve the relevant risk associated with smoking, tobacco use, or whatever they prefer to call it. And they did a good job in identifying and quantifying risk. We have for decades the landmark report starting from the Royal College of Physicians in 1962 and the Surgeon General in 1964. And over time, we know very well, not only us, but also the general population about the risks associated with smoking. But how about addressing and resolving the problem? Well, I don't think that they've made a good job there, because today we have more than 1 billion smokers. There has been a lot of progress when you look at prevalence of smoking as a proportion of the population, but the number of smokers worldwide is tremendous. So we're having a huge problem, and there should be scrutiny about the outcome. Now, there is a mixed, confusing, or according to others, very clear interaction between tobacco harm reduction and the tobacco control community or industry. The FCTC clearly mentions harm reduction as part of a strategy to combat smoking. But the real application of harm reduction in smoking from the WHO or even from other organizations has been minimal and largely unacceptable, with some exceptions, of course, usually individual exceptions, I mean persons, scientists, and in some rare case organizations like, for example, the leading example of the UK in the Public Health England. But harm reduction in general, not only relevant to smoking, but to any other harm, is not only about reducing the harm from substance use. It's also about addressing stigma, marginalization, criminalization, inequalities, oppression. It is about protecting the dignity, not only the health, the liberty, including the liberty of making informed decisions and choices as a person. That's from the National Harm Reduction Coalition. Tobacco harm reduction is also a human rights issue, because the WHO Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion in 1986 clearly states that people cannot achieve their fullest health potential unless they are able to take control of things which determine their health. And public health and the authorities need to ensure people's access to reliable information, not just to information, and to tools, in our case, products too, that help them promote their health. So it's a human rights issue besides everything else. And it was more than 30 years ago that the father of tobacco harm reduction, Professor Michael Russell, discussed about continuous use of nicotine products as long-term substitutes for smoking in non-medical practice, as consumer products. And he realized very early, this is a publication in 1991 in the British Journal of Addiction, he realized very early that such products need to be palatable and acceptable. That's if the smoker doesn't like a product, how can he use the product as a smoking substitute? It's impossible. I mean, it's common sense, let's be honest. And these products will need to be endorsed by the health authorities. There must be some incentives, including price incentives, tax advantages. That was 1991. So today, after more than 30 years, unexpectedly, I mean, if you consider common sense as the expected outcome, we have a growing, an overwhelming, and authoritarian, restrictive, prohibitory approach by the tobacco control about tobacco harm reduction, to the point of equating tobacco cigarettes with those lower risk, combustion-free harm reduction products. We have a clear violation of the principle of risk proportionate regulation. We have a clearly prohibitory agenda based on risk aversion and supposed risk elimination. As you understand, what's the risk elimination if people just continue to smoke and are deprived from harm reduction products? There is no risk elimination. So the question is that science? Does it serve the purpose of properly communicating and properly informing the population about scientific facts and the truth? Well, the results are available in Science. This is the perception of healthcare professionals in Greece in 2016 about the contribution of nicotine on smoking-related atherosclerosis. 66% believe that nicotine plays an extremely or very important role in smoking-related atherosclerosis. The same proportion had the same answer for smoking-related cancer. Nicotine is not a carcinogen, and these are healthcare professionals. What about citizens, smokers, who are not experts? Even worse, less than 5% of smokers perceive e-cigarettes as substantially less harmful than smoking. That was a study in Greece in 2017, not 30 years ago. E-cigarettes didn't exist 30 years ago. But that's the result of the problematic stance of tobacco control, which has been persistently dogmatic, continuously cherry-picking and frequently misinterpreting evidence. They are attempting to suppress criticism at any cost, with ad hominem attacks even to Michael Russell for links with the industry, and other even respectable organizations. I've heard people accusing Public Health England of being funded by the tobacco industry for real or imaginative conflicts, of course, without ever presenting any potential issues relevant to the research content itself. the presentation of data, the data interpretation, the data analysis, nothing. Of course, they are also engaged in a fear-mongering campaign based on an extreme application of the precautionary principle. Keep the precautionary principle in mind. Emphasizing on potentially devastating for the population, but to a significant extent purely theoretical, future risks, and continuous uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 10 years. This is exactly what we were hearing 10 years ago. Now it's again the next 10 years. They invariably assume that the worst-case scenarios are the only possibility. And here are some examples of this fear-mongering campaign. It's very interesting to look at how carefully they created the name EVALI. E-cigarette or vaping product associated lung injury. So if someone misinterprets e-cigarettes, we add vaping. If someone misinterprets vaping, we add e-cigarettes. Even after they admitted that e-cigarettes and nicotine products had nothing to do with EVALI, they kept the same name. It was very carefully chosen, and it would be naive for someone to think that it was just a coincidence. What about the vaping epidemic of kids using electronic cigarettes? The new vaping epidemic from all mass media, from the Surgeon General, from respectable health organizations in the US. But when you look at the data, the picture is not that clear. First of all, smoking rates have been continuously declining at a very fast rate during the period of increased e-cigarette popularity, which mainly involves experimentation, especially among never-smoking adolescents, as we showed in our study. Frequent, regular, daily use is extremely rare among non-smoking adolescents. And current e-cigarette use among US adolescents is continuously declining too. So there was a trend, mostly of experimentation, and current use is any kind of past 30 days use, even one puff, but it is going down pretty rapidly. So the less we talk about it, the less interested the kids become in trying electronic cigarettes. One of the main weapons of the tobacco control industry is the precautionary better safe than sorry principle, which has very, very serious problems. Failure of objectivity. There is no well-designed and structured procedure that uses the precautionary principle consistently without having cognitive and interest-based biases being involved, emotional reactions, ungrounded public perceptions, pressures from lobbyists, and an unreliable, in general, approach to analysis and forecasting. It's very vague. It distracts from great threats. The heavy emphasis on taking and using the precautionary principle for example, the risks associated with harm reduction products draws attention away from any comparative risk with the real problem, which in our case is smoking. It's risk elimination and risk aversion for the least harmful product that results in greater risks by propagating the more harmful product. The precautionary principle is vague and unclear, very ill-defined. It's extremely variable in interpretation. Ad libidum, it is interpreted and applied ad libidum, as the regulator wants to apply it. Lack of comprehensiveness. A comprehensive decision procedure balances the benefit of restricting a product, an activity, anything, and it uses two factors to make this balance. It addresses the potential benefits of the activity that they want to restrict or prohibit, and the cost, the associated risks of the restrictions, the regulations, and the prohibitions that they want to make. Who is doing that from the tobacco control for harm reduction product? No one. They don't care about that. It's only about this risk of e-cigarettes versus an immense risk of smoking, which they don't care about. They frequently use very frequently, it involves inappropriate burden of proof. Activists, not only scientists, have a favored status when they use the precautionary principle. They can raise an issue even if there is no more evidence than their imagination of any potential theoretical future risks. You don't need to prove that there's a risk. Producing and innovating, and we know that harm reduction products, recent harm reduction products are the results of innovation, become de facto crimes for the precautionary principle fanatics. And those who are involved in production and innovation are guilty until proven innocent. It's asymmetrical because it favors the status quo, and the status quo is to have only one nicotine product available in the market, and that's tobacco cigarettes. So it stifles innovation, it's against progress, and it fails to account that inaction can be equally or even more dangerous than action. It fails to accommodate trade-offs, and it tends towards authoritarianism. No use of even the least harmful product is the only acceptable option for tobacco control fanatics. It's not for all the tobacco control movement, but we know what we're talking about. They appear to protect people from their self. They know better for you than you know what's good for you. It denies individuals the freedom to make trade-offs in a way that is recognized by common sense, basically, when you approximate an issue of risk, harm, and benefit. And it is vulnerable to correction because of its vagueness, because it is very ill-defined, and it's very arbitrary. It appeals to the regulators who enjoy expanding their power and are applying it selectively with any rules they prefer. An increase in corruption of the regulatory power is further ensured by making precaution and prevention the default assumption. They appear as the owners of morality. What we are doing is that we are protecting you. We are selling you protection. So maybe in science we trust, but in a US dollar, printed in a US dollar. As Martin Peterson said in a nice article a few years ago, there's nothing wrong with the precautionary principle as long as it's not used for decision making. He wrote that in 2007. I'm not rejecting completely the precautionary principle, but it can be used ad libitum by the regulators. It gives them unlimited power and no control of what they're doing. So the tobacco control tactics is, as we all know and as I've shown previously, using children as the main persistent slogan, which is, of course, appealing to emotion. And what is emotion? A neural impulse that moves an organism to action, prompting automatic reactive behavior that has been adapted through evolution as a survival mechanism. It's not about science, it's about emotion, it's about instinct. But this, using the kids' argument, creates an intergenerational discrimination and shows complete lack of solidarity and empathy for smokers. We don't care about adults, we care about the kids only. The tobacco control movement has also lost focus. Instead of focusing on the harms caused by smoking, by combustion, they are criticizing the behavior of nicotine use with unprecedented closed-mindedness, even during the COVID pandemic, when some of us wrote some studies, performed some studies which showed that there is a potential for nicotine to be beneficial for COVID-19. instead of what they should have done, which is focus on smoking-related health harms. And this lost in focus is in reality moral judgment and outright prejudice. Even worse, these characteristics, together with a strong prohibitory agenda, transform the science, it should have been in quotes, produced by tobacco control into a form of an atheistic religion that should be trusted blindly, but that's not trust, that's almost faith. Experts know better than anyone else. They are the owners of scientific truth and, even worse, of moral knowledge, the only owners of moral knowledge, of justice and injustice, and they present themselves as representing the sole defenders of human rights. However, that's far from the case. Why? Because they fail to respect individuality, personal dignity, autonomy, values, experience, emotions, preference, and the right of everyone to make informed choices. This is a clear form of scientism. Still, their assertions and certainties are based on past experience with tobacco cigarettes, failing to consider, of course, that we're talking about very, very different products. Despite the fact that the same industry is producing these products, and the prospects of these products are not just to be used as consumer products in the way tobacco cigarettes were used, but they have a strong harm reduction that is beneficial for public health prospect, at least for some individuals, and I think for many individuals, not for some. Many in the tobacco control movement seem to deny the provisional nature of scientific knowledge, that proper skepticism, and keep that in mind, is the foundation of the intellectual process. As a well-known physicist, Richard Feynman, said, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts, not in the knowledge of experts. And when someone says that science teaches us, he's not using the right word. Science doesn't teach, experience teaches. Feynman also discussed about the totality of evidence. Of course, it's interesting and important to hear about experiments, but you have to be patient and listen to all the evidence and then judge whether a sensible conclusion has been arrived at. Uncertainty is central to morality, and science is constructive skepticism. And as Henry Bauer published in 2006 about skepticism, skepticism views the probability of a proposition as always less than 1. So everything is not entirely certainly a reality. Whereas belief or disbelief are absolute. They are asserting that the probability is either 0, disbelief, or 1 for belief. So he created the term microskepticism, which means questioning the soundness of every detail or fact, method, and logic. And microskepticism is empirical. It's based on experience. By contrast, macroskepticism is deductive. It relies on current scientific evidence, so in reality, previously acquired knowledge, which makes it backward-looking and destructively critical, not creatively critical. I'm sure you understand whether the tobacco control is applying microskepticism or macroskepticism. And there are several contemporary examples, that's what he wrote in this paper, where the native conservatism and dogmatism of science have become tyrannies, knowledge monopolies, and research cartels because science has become so much governed by official bureaucracies. And I think that tobacco control appears to be one of those examples. That's my quote, not from Henry Bauer. And I think what the tobacco control does is use the Occam razor of simple is usually the right answer, but there are cases where the simple answers are the wrong answers. In that case, the tobacco control is simply using the past experience with tobacco and smoking in order to address the future risks of harm reduction products. Simple, but very, very wrong. The anti-harm reduction hysteria by tobacco control is becoming an oppressive, intolerant, and authoritarian form of political correctness, not only for smokers, but also for scientists who have different views than they have. And that resembles what Max Weber wrote more than a century ago in his essay about bureaucracies and capitalism. Tobacco control, unfortunately, resembles a bureaucratic giant which concentrates large amounts of power in a small number of people. They tend to generate oligarchy. They create an inescapable fate of further bureaucratization and rationalization, but that's not rational. So in reality, they have created the Max Weber's iron cage inside which we are all allowed to move only inside this iron cage. But that's the pessimistic side of the story. What's the future? For the future, I will use some quotes from another Russell, not Michael Russell, but Bertrand Russell, who is a famous historian, mathematician, philosopher, was famous. And I'm going to use the 10 commandments of critical thinking and democratic decency, which apply perfectly to tobacco control and tobacco harm reduction. He said that the best answer to fanaticism is liberalism. And his decalogue dictates that we should not feel absolutely certain of anything. We do not think it worthwhile to proceed by concealing evidence, for the evidence is sure to come to light. We should never try to discourage thinking, for you are sure to succeed when you try. When you meet with opposition, we've seen fearful opposition, endeavor to overcome it by argument and not by authority, for a victory depends upon authority is unreal and illusory. Have no respect for the authority of others, for there are always contrary authorities to be found. Do not use power to suppress opinions you think are pernicious, for if you do, the opinions will eventually suppress you. Do not fear to be eccentric in opinion, for every opinion now accepted was once eccentric. I think we are facing that, a lot of us. Find more pleasure in intelligent dissent than in passive agreement, for if you value intelligence, as you should, the former implies a deeper agreement than the latter. Be scrupulously truthful, even if the truth is inconvenient, for it is more inconvenient when you try to conceal it. And finally, do not feel envious for the supposed happiness of those who live in a fool's paradise, for only a fool will think that this is happiness. So I think we should follow the guidance of the father of tobacco harm reduction, Professor Michael Russell, and one of the quotes in the Decalogue of Bertrand Russell. Do not fear to be eccentric in opinion, for every opinion now accepted was once eccentric. Thank you very much.